The year 1942 was a fulcrum on which the fate of the world was balanced. On June 4th, 1942, the momentum of the war in the Pacific shifted when the U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway. After Midway, Japan did not have another victory in the Pacific. In the autumn of '42, the British broke out from El Alamein. They prevented Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps from taking control of the Suez Canal. More importantly, they kept Germany from gaining free access to the oil of the Middle East. Rommel's defeat was the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht. Throughout the merciless Russian winter of 1942, 2 million-man armies held a ghastly death grip on each other in and around Stalingrad. Some contend Adolf Hitler ordered the conquest of Stalingrad because of his hatred for Joseph Stalin. Some contend that Stalin's ego drove his order to defend the city with, quote, "not one step backwards," unquote. Whatever the reasons, in 6 months of street-by-street combat, 1,530,000 had been killed, wounded, or captured. On February 2nd, 1943, 93,000 German troops surrounded in Stalingrad surrendered. Only 6,000 of them would live to return to Germany. Hitler's army was in retreat in the east from then on. There was another pivotal battle that took place in May of 1942, one that was little noted or long remembered. Following the fall of Rangoon in March of 1942, the Japanese 56th Brigade, the elite Dragon Division, poured up the Burma Road through China's back door. The last big obstacle between it and the wartime capital city of Chongqing was the Salween River and its mile-deep gorge.
If we had not stopped these people at the Salween River, China would have collapsed. And if China had collapsed, we'd have had a different situation in the world.
On May 7th, 1942, the 56th Brigade seemed unopposed as it flowed up the Burma Road, China's vital supply line, until David Lee Tex Hill and 7 other American volunteer pilots dived their war-weary shark's tooth P-40s into the mile-deep gorge of China's Salween River. Fitted with 500-pound Russian-made bombs, the Flying Tigers made a desperate attempt to prevent the complete collapse of China. It was a mission that would change the war in the China-Burma-India theater. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. In a sense, David Lee Tex Hill and the 20th century China he loved and defended grew up together. When Tex was born on the Korean Peninsula on July 13, 1915, the modern Republic of China, formed after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, was a struggling 3-year-old.
I was born to missionary parents. I was born in Korea, and I was the youngest child, and Daddy's health broke down. He'd been out there a long time, and I was only a year and a half old, so I don't remember a whole lot about Korea. Daddy came back to Virginia, where all of my people are from, and he worked on Grandpa's farm, and then he bought a place himself. And my early recollections there were working out there on the farm. Well, Daddy was a great preacher, and he got his health back and started back into preaching in a little church called St. Elmo there. And he was called to Louisville, Kentucky, First Presbyterian Church there, and was there a couple of years. And then he was called to San Antonio in 1921. This was a big church, an old church here. And people just loved Dad, and he built it into the biggest Presbyterian church in the Southern Assembly.
One of Dr. Hill's benefits was the use of a church member's home in the Texas Hill Country near San Antonio. Texas, in particular the West Texas of the 1920s, was a place that shaped young David Hill's world ever after.
As I say, my earliest recollections, of course, were my family, and my dad was predominantly remembered because he was a great outdoorsman, and he took me hunting and fishing. He was a great fisherman and hunter. And from my earliest days, you know, learned to hunt and fish and live in the outdoors. In those days, living in the outdoors, you know, it wasn't like it is today. I mean, it was primitive. We had our bedding rolls and built a big fire at night and lie down and get up at daylight in the morning, and Daddy'd fix breakfast. But that type of life I enjoyed so much, and a lot of my early days I worked on ranches, and I liked that type of life, you know. Anybody, I think, that's been in the outdoors, it equips them very well, you know, to do what we were doing later on, you know, as far as a fighter pilot operation.
Beneath the boundless Texas skies, another fascination was growing in the mind of young David Hill.
You know, when we first came to San Antonio in '21, we had a Korean that came over, and he lived with us, Dr. Moon Hyung Nim, and he taught me how to make kites. And the Koreans are great on kites. And flying kites was really a great hobby. I built many of them. And he had some very fancy kind of kites that you don't normally see. And that kind of got my interest. I had a good-looking sister, and I had a good-looking cousin. And these guys from McKelly would come around with their helmet and goggles on, you know. And I thought that was pretty cool, you know.
David Lee Hill's growing fixation with flying finally pushed him to commit an uncharacteristic act.
A guy by the name of Chet Sluter and I decided we were going to take an airplane ride. So we took our collection money and slipped off from church and went out here to a place called Winburn Field, but it's right over there near Stinson, actually. We paid this guy $1 to take us around the pattern. A guy named Dick Hare was the pilot. And in the travel area, you could always tell because the aileron stuck out further than the wings, and the pilot sits in the back, and you got a seat, side-by-side seat in the front. I just remember that it was just a real thrill, and then I began to worry about my conscience taking my collection money on Sunday for an airplane ride.
Young David Lee was also intrigued by his father's remembrances of the Far East.
I did want to get back to the Far East, and I'd heard Daddy speak about it.
Tex Hill would indeed return to the Far East. But as a boy hunting and fishing the West Texas Hill Country in the 1920s, he could never have imagined the circumstances under which he would make the journey. A world away from Tex Hill's West Texas, 4,000 years of dynastic rule in China were coming to a complicated end. Modern China was born in October 1911, in a military uprising that led to the abdication of China's last emperor. The birth of the Chinese Republic brought with it great promise and great danger. The nation that rose from the ashes of the old Chinese dynasties would, in the next century, shake the world, not once, but many times. The people of China have shared a common culture for more than 4,000 years, longer than any other civilization on Earth. The earliest Chinese settled in northern China, in the valley of the Yellow River around 3000 BC. They farmed the fertile river valley, made pottery, wove silk cloth, and used simple wheeled carts. The history of China prior to the 20th century could be characterized as a continual struggle against foreign occupation. The first known dynasty appeared in 1766 BC, the Shang dynasty. New methods of agriculture helped give rise to a highly developed system of king, nobles, commoners, and slaves. With well-organized armies, the Shang kings unified the region and defended it against nomadic raiders. Shang craftsmen worked in bronze and jade. The Zhou overthrew the Shang kings about 3,000 years ago, and the Zhou dynasty lasted for 900 years. Iron tools opened more land to farming and created food surpluses. A middle class arose. Zhou kings unified the country, created the first national library in 550 BC, and supported priests, scholars, and teachers. Among the scholars was the philosopher Confucius. His code of ethics, developed around 500 BC, was the foundation of Chinese thought and culture for the next 2,500 years. The Zhou kings worshipped heaven as a deity. They and all of the kings and emperors to follow would be called sons of heaven, and China would be called the Celestial Empire. Ancestor worship emerged during the Zhou dynasty, and it is still a strong influence in all Asian cultures. The early Zhou kings ruled a realm that was divided among some 200 nobles, similar to the feudal system of medieval Europe. Strong nobles overthrew weaker princes until, by 400 BC, there were only 7 states in the kingdom, each ruled by a noble family. In 221 BC, the strongest of these noble families, the Qin, declared themselves emperor. Their reign lasted less than 100 years, but it left 2 important legacies. The Qin gave the country its name, China, and replaced the feudal system with a centralized bureaucracy. For the next 2,000 years, China was ruled by a series of emperors, some strong, some weak. The country was divided and unified many times over. Chinese emperors built the world's first university in 221 BC, built the Great Wall, standardized weights and measures, and created a civil service based on merit and education. The Chinese invented the world's first sundials, water clocks, wheelbarrows, compasses, paper, canal locks, firearms, and super ships, immense seagoing junks that could carry 1,000 passengers. Over and over again, the settled farms and cities of China were attacked by nomadic foreigners from all sides. The Chinese called all such foreigners barbarians. Mongols from the northern plains conquered China in the 13th century. Their short 90-year rule left a much larger legacy in the West. When the Venetian merchant Marco Polo wrote about his travels to China, he described the court of Mongol Kublai Khan. His book, Marco Polo's Travels, was a bestseller in Europe for 300 years. In the late 1600s, China entered a long period of peace and prosperity under the Qing emperors. Western traders and missionaries were welcomed, but the army was neglected, and a population boom brought a shortage of land and a rise in poverty. In the 19th century, 2 wars against Western powers, the so-called Opium Wars, left China defeated and humiliated, forced to open its markets and ports to free trade with the West. Poverty, war, and foreign meddling in internal affairs led to several rebellions that ravaged China's economy and weakened its emperor. The Boxer Rebellion of 1898 was aimed at expelling all foreigners from the Celestial Empire. It failed. The terms of the peace imposed by Japan and the Western powers humiliated the Chinese and rallied support for nationalist revolutionaries. One of the leaders who emerged from the turbulent 1890s was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a physician who advocated replacing the Manchu dynasty with a republic. After a failed uprising in Canton in 1895, Dr. Sun fled the country and lived in self-imposed exile, traveling and enlisting support for his revolution. In October 1911, Chinese soldiers staged a rebellion in Wuhan. Within 2 months, all the southern, central, and northwestern provinces had declared independence from the emperor's rule. In February, the Manchu emperor abdicated peacefully, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial government. Sun Yat-sen returned from exile to lead a transitional government in the new Republic of China. In March 1912, Sun Yat-sen stepped down from the presidency, and Yun Shikai, former commander of the Northern Army, took his place. Several revolutionary groups merged to form the National People's Party, the Kuomintang. General Yuan set up a republican government headed by a premier and cabinet. He drafted a constitution and laid plans for a parliamentary election in early 1913. But behind the scenes, Yuan had his opponents assassinated and moved to sideline the parliament and weaken the constitution. Less than 3 years after his inauguration, Yuan declared himself president for life and began scheming to make himself emperor. But in 1915, Japan exploited the turmoil with a list of demands for special trading rights and other privileges. The resulting crisis shattered Yuan's control, and he died in 1916. Finally, in 1921, Sun Yat-sen succeeded in forming a new Republican government. And in 1921, David Lee Hill was an impetuous 8-year-old attending Traverse Elementary School in San Antonio, Texas.
Well, I was always in some sort of trouble. I went to Traverse School, and I remember Miss Berry, who was the principal, she, back in those days, you know, they believed very much in corporal punishment. And I had a run-in with Miss Berry, and she broke out the switch.
World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. China had joined the Allies in declaring war on Germany. At the peace conference in France, the Chinese demanded an end to foreign treaty ports and other concessions in China. Their demands were ignored, and they felt disillusioned and betrayed. There were angry demonstrations in Beijing and other cities. The government, frustrated with its Western allies, turned to Russia for help. The Communist Party of China, led by a peasant named Mao Zedong, held its first conference in 1921, but it was so small that the Soviet Union gave its support to Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang, or KMT. Soviet aid built up the KMT army. Sun died in 1926 and was succeeded by Chiang Kai-Shek. Chiang was born October 31st, 1887, to an upper-middle-class family of salt merchants. He would go on to become one of the most powerful and controversial military and political leaders of the 20th century. Growing up in a tumultuous China, racked by military defeats at the hands of foreign powers and civil wars among warlords, Chiang decided to pursue a military career. Ironically, Chiang entered a preparatory school for Chinese students in Japan, the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. It was here that he was influenced to support the movement to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a Chinese republic. Chiang returned to China in 1911 to serve as an artillery officer for the revolutionary forces. Over the next decade, with political guile and personal loyalty, he gained Sun Yat-sen's trust. On June 5, 1925, he became Generalissimo Commander-in-Chief of the National Revolutionary Army. In 1926, Chiang launched an expedition to subdue the northern warlords. He accepted Soviet aid but began throwing communists out of the Nationalist Party. By 1928, the warlords were reined in, and the country was once again unified. Chiang continued to suppress the communists. They began organizing in the countryside, and their numbers grew quickly, fueled by anger over the slow pace of land reforms. In late 1931, they declared a separate Chinese Soviet Republic in the south, with Mao as chairman. Chiang began a series of brutal extermination campaigns to destroy the Communist Party, and in Chiang's preoccupation with the communists and disloyal warlords, the expansionist Japanese saw opportunity.
I went to the San Antonio Academy and graduated in 28. Military school, it is the oldest military school. It's something like 120 years old. But at that time, it was a high school level. And the professors, they had to be tough because they had some tough guys in there, my older brothers especially. Like the other day, I was at the Alumni Day, and because I'm a white rabbit, I mean, I'm the oldest living graduate. And I just told these kids, I said, you know, you guys are the hope of the world. I said, if you guys don't make it, I mean, this country's gone because we have nothing we can do at our age. And I said, just remember this, to any audience that I've ever talked to, that if you see a guy in uniform, you better get on your knees and thank God, because that is the only guy in the world that can save you.
In the fall of 1928, Tex Hill enrolled in the Macaulay School, another prestigious military school near Chattanooga, Tennessee. His restlessness and pranks earned him many disciplinary restrictions. When he graduated at 17, Tex was ready to enlist in the Navy, but his father had other ideas. He strongly encouraged him to enter college. Tex graduated from Austin College in 1938.
Saw an ad in the paper where they're looking for pilots. So I went down and took the exam before I graduated. You had to have a college degree. Now, I tried to get into the Army Air Corps earlier, and I was turned down, and I don't know why. You could go in with 2 years, 2 years of college. To this good day, I still don't know why I was turned down. And I don't know whether it was my eyes or what, I just don't know. But anyway, it was kind of funny to wind up after a career in the Navy and everything, and then in July of '42, when our group broke up, you know, the Army Air Corps wanted me bad.
In China, the Japanese were capitalizing on the domestic turmoil facing Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek and the nationalist Chinese. Japan saw Manchuria as a limitless supply of raw materials, a market for her manufactured goods, now excluded from many Western countries by Depression-era tariffs, and as a protective buffer state against the Soviet Union in Siberia. Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931 and set up a puppet government in northern China. There was the growing anti-Japanese feeling in China, but Chiang ignored it. He declared that he would deal with Japanese aggression only after he had dealt with the communists. Finally, in late 1936, the Kuomintang Army forced Chiang to give up his anti-communist campaigns, form an alliance with the Chinese Communist Party, and face the Japanese threat head-on. 6 months later, a skirmish between Chinese and Japanese troops at Beijing's Marco Polo Bridge set off the spark that ignited all-out war between China and Japan. In 1937, when China's resistance to Japanese aggression escalated into the largest Asian land war in history, the military career of Tex Hill was just getting started. The career of an Army Air Corps pilot who would change Tex Hill's life forever was seemingly coming to an end. Claire Lee Chennault was born September 6, 1893 in Commerce, Texas, and raised in Waterproof, Louisiana, a tiny farming town in the Mississippi Delta. He had a pleasant childhood, Tom Sawyerish by some accounts, though he later described himself as something of a loner. He attended a one-room schoolhouse and in 1909 entered Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge. He was a good student and participated in ROTC and in basketball, baseball, and track. He also applied to West Point and Annapolis. As an adult, Chennault always gave his birth year as 1890, adding 3 years to his age. After one semester at LSU, he transferred to a teacher's college and a year later, in 1910, at age 17, went to work as the teacher and principal of a country school near Shreveport. Chennault married Nellie Thompson on Christmas Day 1911 and left teaching to find work that would support a family. The United States entered the First World War in April 1917. Chennault quit his job at a tire factory, joined the U.S. Army, and earned the rank of first lieutenant. Stationed at Fort Travis in San Antonio, Texas, he was near Kelly Field, the Army's pilot training base. Chennault snagged an assignment to Kelly Field as a drill instructor. He was still at Kelly Field when the war ended, and he finally got the assignment he had hoped for, as a U.S. Army aviation cadet. Private flying lessons had taught him some bad habits, and a civilian instructor at Kelly washed him out of the aviation program. A second check ride with a military pilot got him reinstated, and he earned his U.S. Army wings in April 1919. He served a brief tour patrolling the Mexican border and was given a routine discharge into the Army Reserve. When Congress expanded the Army Air Service in 1920, Chennault re-entered active service as a flying officer. He served mostly in non-flying assignments until 1922, when he was sent to the famous Hat in the Ring Squadron, the 94th, at Ellington Field, Texas. Chennault proved to be a superb pilot. After a year in the 94th, he was given command of the 19th Pursuit Squadron based on Ford Island at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and Chennault flew coastal patrols and set up an early warning system of aircraft spotters. Deafness was a common problem among military pilots of the day who flew open cockpit airplanes. Chennault was no exception. He flew with a medical waiver for deafness, logging over 1,300 hours in the air. In 1930, with the rank of captain, Chennault was sent to the Air Corps Tactical School and joined the faculty as head of the Pursuit Section. It was the birthplace of the doctrine of precision daylight bombing, the idea that fast, heavily armed bombers would always get through to their targets. A tight-knit group of officers, who became known as the Bomber Mafia, believed that the bombers' speed, high altitude, long-range, heavy armament, and tight formations would overcome any defenses thrown at them. Boeing's new YB-17 bomber seemed to confirm these claims. The prototype that would become the B-17 Flying Fortress could fly faster and higher than the Army's frontline fighters, and it bristled with guns. No anti-aircraft shell can reach it, and no pursuit plane can catch it, so said the advocates of daylight strategic bombing. They claimed that fighter escorts would be unnecessary. Besides, they said, even the best pursuit planes lack the speed and the range needed to escort the bomber. As a student at the tactical school, Chennault met Captain Clayton Bissell, a World War I ace. Bissell was a true believer in the bomber doctrine. Chennault disagreed. The Army had recently received the new Boeing's P-12 biplane, the world's fastest and most agile pursuit aircraft. Chennault believed that pursuit planes like the P-12 could shoot down bombers. But, said Chennault, progress would also bring faster, more capable pursuit aircraft. Bissell and others believed that the age of the pursuit plane was over. While the bomber mafia won converts in Washington, Chennault practiced aerobatics and thought about pursuit tactics against bombers. He and Bissell would clash again over tactics in China during World War II. The commander of the tactical school asked Chennault to form an exhibition flight team for the Army. Flying P-12s, they put on a three-plane aerobatic show like no other. At the team's final performance in late 1935, there were two men in the audience who would later have profound influence on the life and career of Claire Chennault. One was William Pauley, a salesman who represented the Curtiss-Wright Aircraft Company in China. The other was Mao Pang-Chu, a senior officer in the Chinese Air Force. Both men were impressed by what they saw that day. Mao offered to hire all three pilots as flight instructors for the Chinese. Chennault's two fellow pilots accepted the offer and soon left for China. Chennault declined. In Italy, General Julio Douay declared that bomber formations could reach any city and that fighter aircraft would be useless against heavily armed bombers. Douay's ideas became required reading at the U.S. Army Air Corps Tactical School. The U.S. Army's 1931 war games had only strengthened the argument when pursuit planes were unable to catch a single bomber. Chennault's experience on the aerobatic team convinced him more than ever that fighters could shoot down bombers, diving attacks, concentrated gunnery, and teamwork. He argued for better tactics, better communications, and an early warning system that could direct fighters to incoming bomber formations. But in Washington and other places that mattered, the bomber mafia had won the argument. Chennault was seen as a difficult officer, a competent leader who argued too much with his superiors.
The funny thing is that Chennault had been right all along about the requirements for fighters versus bombers, and now he's an outcast in his own Air Force. He's given a foreign Air Force in which he could implement it, and his tactical decision was to use the best fighters he could obtain, which in the event turned out to be P-40s, and use their maximum capabilities. And he knew that from observation, he knew what the Japanese strengths were. He had seen the Nakajimas and the Mitsubishis over China, and he knew that they were good airplanes, but that they had certain qualities which could be offset by the qualities of the P-40. So he was playing a winning hand, although it seemed, that it would be hard to define that to begin with. He actually knew what he was doing. He actually knew what tactics to use, and he was able to achieve what he wanted to do.
Chennault's health was also a problem. He was active and energetic, but he was flying on a medical waiver for his deafness. And his chain smoking, up to 3 packs of unfiltered Camels a day, was catching up with him. Chennault could see that his military career was effectively over. Promoted to major, he was sent to the 20th Pursuit Group as its executive officer. There, flight surgeons grounded him, then sent him to the hospital. The Army invited him to retire, which he did in 1937. He and Nellie had bought a farm near Waterproof, Louisiana. Nellie was content there, but Chennault was not. He had been quietly negotiating with the Chinese to study and analyze the Chinese Air Force, a 3-month assignment at far above his Army pay. The day after he retired from the Army, Chennault boarded a ship in San Francisco bound for China. Tex Hill had a date to keep in Appalachia, Florida. He had enlisted in the United States Navy as a seaman second class. Along with 110 other candidates, he was now going to Florida to try to gain acceptance for flight training.
I rode a motorcycle down there, going through Louisiana. Most buggers hit those goggles and just have to stop and wipe your goggles off to even see. Never seen anything like it. But I got down to Opelika and they wouldn't let me keep it on the base. And so I went through and made it down there. There were 12 of us out of 110. 10 of us out of that 12 were sent to Pensacola for flight training. I rode my motorcycle back and sold it. I'm sorry, because it was the first 61 Harley. It's a Harley 61. It's the first one that came out that had the overhead valves on it. I think they called it a knucklehead. That bike was, today, would be worth a lot of money. And at Pensacola, the training was probably the best in the world. We had almost 13 months training. And when you came out of there, well, you're qualified to do anything. And you're ready to go to the fleet.
Tex's training was thorough and intense. There was 55 hours of aerobatics and gunnery in an F-4B-4, then primary seaplanes, the N-3N on floats, then to Squadron 3 and Steerman's, then to instrument and fighter training. And in training, Tex showed the characteristic self-confidence that would later make him an Air Force legend.
You know, everybody, always sweating. Wondering where you're going to pass these checks or not, because a heck of a lot to do with the instructor. Whether they can teach you to fly, because then they got other check pilots that are going to check you. But I've always, had confidence in myself. I know what I can do and what I can't do. like this old friend of mine gave me some sage advice. He said, Tex, don't ever lie to yourself. I went to the Saratoga and I was flying TBDs. I never will forget when I reported on board, there was a guy took me in hand by the name of Bob Dosey. He had been in a much earlier class back when they had cadets. On my orientation ride, good God, he was looping that damn thing and doing rolls in it. And boy, I tell you, you'd have washed out real fast. If you'd have done anything like that, at Pensacola with that airplane.
Through it all, Tex held his desire to return to the Far East of his birth.
I had no problems, but I did want to get back to the Far East. And I'd heard Daddy speak about it as a missionary, and I wanted to get back over there. And we had a heavy cruise over there called the Houston. The Navy was real good about letting you make a transfer. Well, I'd put in for a transfer to the Houston. Well, fortunately, it didn't go through. Houston got sunk. I was transferred to the East Coast to the Ranger flying SB-2U dive bombers. It was kind of interesting because we actually were involved in war before. We really were. And the way we were involved, we were operating out of Bermuda, where these convoys would make up. The Brits had a task force that would escort the people and kind of shepherd them, you know, the convoys going over with supplies.
As fate would have it, Tex Hill would indeed be involved in the war before we really were, but it would not be as a member of the U.S. Navy, and he would return to the Far East. Unbeknownst to Tex, half a world away, an aviation visionary who had been driven out of his own Air Force was busy readying his accommodations.
We were stationed in Norfolk and walked into the ready room, and there's Gus Whithelm. He said, "Here's some guys that'll go with you." He was our operations officer. We didn't even know what he was talking about, you know. And he introduced us as Commander Irvine. He said, Commander Irvine said, "We're looking for volunteers to keep the Burma Road open so supplies can flow into China." And we didn't even know where Burma was. He pulled a big map. This is Burma, this is the Burma Road. Supplies going on up into China. So I was anxious to get back anyway. But Ed Rector and me and Bert Crispin, and there was 7 of us off that carrier that wanted to go. The way we were actually structured, Chennault had come to the States. China Air Force had been decimated, it's in name only. And they needed an instant Air Force if they were going to stay in the war. And Chennault came back, and Hap Arnold, George Marshall, Admiral Tower, Stimson, they were all against it. They said, it's just one of Chennault's pipe dreams. So Chennault, through a guy named Joe Alsop, who's kin to the president some way. So he was able to set up a meeting with Chennault and Roosevelt. And Chennault convinced Roosevelt that if you want to keep China in the war, he said, you're going to have an instant Air Force over there. So they set up all this stuff. And it's a funny thing because there's a requirement that Chennault he wanted 100 fighter pilots for $500 pursuit experience. And General Arnold told him, they said, Chennault, if I were to give you that many airplanes, that many pilots with that kind of experience, he said, you'd fold up my entire pursuit section. And Chennault always endeared himself by saying, General, if you can't spare that many people with that kind of experience, you don't have any pursuit section to begin with.
1937. For the second time in 40 years, Japan is attempting to make territorial gains within the borders of China. 2 years before the onset of World War II in Europe, and 4 years before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the largest Asian land war in history is raging. The suffering of the civilian population is as horrendous as it is widespread. Much of it is a result of the indiscriminate bombings of civilian population centers, bombings which go virtually unchallenged by the Chinese Air Force. In 1937, conventional military wisdom stated the bombers would always get through, that modern bombers, self-protected by onboard ordnance, could not be stopped by pursuit or fighter aircraft. Not everyone agreed. As a captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps, Claire L. Chennault had argued up and down with his superiors that, with the right tactics, pursuit aircraft could effectively defend against the bombers. In fact, Chennault effectively argued himself into a premature retirement from the U.S. Army Air Corps at age 42. In China, theoretical debates meant little. As fate would have it, in the cauldron of the Second Sino-Japanese War, with the whole world watching, Claire Chennault would be given a second chance, a chance to prove the tactical worth of pursuit aircraft in real-time combat conditions. But first, he would have to find airplanes and pilots with which to do it. To save the now decimated Chinese Air Force, Chennault needed trained, experienced fighter pilots from outside China. He needed a cadre of U.S. pilots willing to risk their military careers to help defend a nation and a culture a half a world away. A proud, ancient culture that was being brought to its knees by modern weaponry. Chennault needed men like triple ace David Lee Tex Hill, men who were willing to fly combat even though their own country was not yet in the war. Men who were willing and able to fly missions that changed the war. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War.
Well, I think he would have walked through fire for General Chennault. He just almost idolized him. He respected him so and believed in him so that he would have done anything he asked him. And I would have never questioned it, not in the heat of war at all. I don't think people felt that way. I certainly never did.
He just exudes confidence. He just, I know that I was impressed where if it told me to go through that wall, I'd go.
The day after he officially retired from the Army, Claire L. Chennault, who had been quietly negotiating with the Chinese a 3-month assignment to analyze the Chinese Air Force, boarded a ship in San Francisco bound for China. Just a few days earlier, aircraft from the German Luftwaffe had bombed the city of Guernica, Spain, in support of the nationalist troops of Francisco Franco. The raid killed hundreds of civilians. The world saw it as a terror bombing, a grisly confirmation of the prevailing wisdom about strategic bombers. En route to China, Chennault's ship docked overnight in Kobe, on Japan's main island. Chennault and a companion spent the time ashore doing some amateur spying on Japanese civil defense measures. The next stop was Shanghai, China. A so-called treaty city, Shanghai was governed and garrisoned by several Western countries, including Britain and the United States. Outside of Shanghai, Hong Kong, and a few other treaty cities, China was a patchwork of rulers and alliances. The Soviet Union and Chinese communists controlled northern provinces. The Japanese occupied Manchuria, and independent warlords held the rest of the country. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek was the leader of China's nationalist party, the Kuomintang. But his rule was limited to the Yangtze River Delta in central China. Western allies considered Chiang to be China's leader, but to many Chinese, he was merely the strongest of the warlords. In June 1937, when Chennault arrived in Shanghai, China and Japan were not officially at war. There had been intermittent fighting since 1931, local skirmishes that both sides described as incidents. China was racked by civil war. On one side, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-Shek. On the other, the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong. In 1931, Japan exploited the turmoil to invade Manchuria. Japanese propaganda presented the invasion as a holy war, aimed at uniting all of Asia under Japanese rule. By 1935, Japan controlled northern China through a puppet government, and the Japanese were exploiting internal conflicts to expand their influence. China appealed to the League of Nations for help against the invaders. The League issued a weak condemnation of Japan's invasion of Manchuria, but appeasement was the policy of the day, and no other country was willing to intervene in any meaningful way. Through the 1930s, both countries had reasons to avoid all-out war. The Kuomintang needed to unify its warring internal factions and defeat the Chinese communists. The Japanese wanted to avoid any foreign intervention, especially by the United States. In Shanghai, Chennault was introduced to Madame Chiang Kai-Shek. The Generalissimo's young, charming, and beautiful wife was raised in the U.S. and educated at Wellesley College. She was a modernist, in contrast to her traditionalist husband. And in 1936, she took on the role of Secretary General of the Chinese Commission on Aeronautical Affairs. It was she who had hired Claire Chennault. In 1937, Claire L. Chennault, a recently retired captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps, traveled to China for a 3-month assignment to evaluate the Chinese Air Force for Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek and the head of the Air Force, his wife, Madame Chiang. After meeting Madame Chiang in Shanghai, Chennault traveled to Nanking. Chennault met with General Chow Chi-jo, commander of the Chinese Air Force, the CAF. Chow's Italian advisor, General Silvio Scaroni, also briefed Chennault. From there, Chennault went on to visit several CAF airfields and flight schools, including the primary flight school run by Americans at Hangzhou. Early July found him at Luoyang, where Italian pilots ran a flight school, assembled airplanes, and flew combat missions against the Chinese communists. On July 7, 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army stormed the Marco Polo Bridge, a key access point to Beijing. Prior to this incident, the Chinese central government had pursued a policy of first internal pacification before external resistance. But this incident marked the breaking point of Japanese aggression. It was time to focus first on the foreign enemy. Chiang took direct command of the Chinese Central Government Army and Air Force. Full-scale war was now at hand. Claire Chennault immediately offered his services to the Chinese. He was sent to Nanchang, a dusty city in China's interior, to train the CAF pilots for war. On July 23, he sent a discouraging report to the Generalissimo on the CAF's readiness for combat. Its warplanes included 100 obsolete Curtiss Hawk biplanes, 21 Italian, German, and American-built bombers, and 10 Boeing P-26 fighters. Its pilots were poorly trained, barely able to handle docile trainers, much less frontline fighter planes. The Chinese Army's combat readiness was not much better. With very little military-industrial strength, China had few armored forces and no mechanized divisions. Still, Chiang knew that to win international support, he had to prove that his armies could fight. Chiang struck back at the Japanese at the port city of Shanghai. The Japanese cruiser Izumo was anchored there, providing artillery support for the invaders. The Chinese Air Force, with Chennault as advisor, was ordered to silence Izumo's guns. The air attack was a disaster. The Chinese bombardiers failed to adjust and dropped most of their loads on the city, killing some 3,000 civilians. The fighter pilots that Chennault was training had a better day. From Taiwan, the Japanese sent 18 Mitsubishi G-3M Nell bombers to hit Chinese airfields. Chinese fighters jumped them at Hangzhou, destroying 3 with no losses of their own. The next day, another 16 Nell bombers attacked Nanking. They were unescorted, and the Chinese fighters downed 4 and damaged another 6. On that same day, the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga sent 12 Mitsubishi B-2M biplane bombers to attack Hangzhou. Only one returned. Chennault was earning his instructor's pay. But by late August, Japanese fighters were escorting the bombers. The Chinese biplane Hawks were no match for the fast and agile escorts. Open cockpit monoplanes with fixed landing gear, similar to the Boeing P-26. Chennault, like most Westerners, did not believe that the Japanese could design or build advanced aircraft. The new escorts were at first thought to be German Heikels or French Dugatines. They were, in fact, Mitsubishi A-5Ms, allied name Claude, a Japanese design and direct ancestor of the Japanese Zero. Assigned to set up air defenses at Nanking, Chennault established a simple but effective early warning system. Spotters at locations around the city reported by Army field telephones to a map room in the city's stadium, where incoming bogies were plotted. To control the fighters, Chennault put a radio in each leader's airplane, so the plotters at the stadium could vector the fighters to intercept the incoming enemy planes. Shanghai and Hangzhou adopted similar systems. As Japanese bombers and escort fighters began to dominate the daytime skies, Chennault shifted his forces to dawn and dusk raids. He trained his bomber pilots by mocking up Japanese ships with patterns of lights on the runways. When the bombers attacked the ships, their searchlights and muzzle flashes guided the bombers in, and their bombs damaged several Japanese warships. Chennault often accompanied these missions as an observer, evaluating Chinese and Japanese tactics from the cockpit of a Curtiss Hawk. The Imperial Japanese Army captured Shanghai in November 1937 at the cost of 250,000 casualties. The capture of Shanghai opened the way to Nanking, China's former capital city. Nanking fell on December 13th. Japanese troops entering the city embarked on a bloodbath known as the Rape of Nanking. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and disarmed Chinese soldiers were murdered, and between 20,000 and 80,000 Chinese women were raped by Japanese soldiers in 6 weeks of terror in Nanking. An international mix of mercenary pilots descended on China in the wake of the Japanese invasion of Shanghai. Idealists, thrill-seekers, out-of-work airline and airmail pilots, most of them claimed combat experience in World War I. Their flying skills ran from excellent to non-existent. Their skill at carousing was uniformly high. Chennault organized them into the CAF 14th Squadron and began weeding out the incompetents and training the rest. Based at Hangzhou, the 14th was equipped with 30 Vultee light bombers. The squadron flew its first mission with 4 Vultees on 23 January 1938. 2 of the bombers turned back and 1 crashed. The remaining bomber failed to find its target. Soon after that abortive raid, Japanese bombers attacked Hangzhou. The Vultees were lined up wingtip to wingtip, fueled and armed. A bomb hit one of them, and the entire line was incinerated. Chiang was frustrated with his German and Italian advisors, and he sacked them. He was sorely in need of serviceable airplanes and competent pilots. Rebuffed by the Western Allies, he turned to the Russians. In exchange for Chinese raw materials, the Soviet Union provided more than 300 aircraft, battle-proven I-15 and I-16 fighters, and twin-engine Tupolev SB bombers. Arriving in China over the winter of 1937-38, half the Russian airplanes came with their own pilots and mechanics. The rest were turned over to CAF units and crews. The Japanese protested to the Soviet Union, which ignored the complaints. The United States, more sensitive to neutrality issues, tried to convince American pilots to leave China and stopped others from entering. Other Western nations followed suit. Soon, nearly all the pilots defending China against the Japanese were Chinese or Russian. The Russians did not like or trust Chennault. He was sending regular reports to Washington on Japanese airplanes and tactics. As the Russians suspected, he was also reporting on their strengths and weaknesses. Chiang continued to shake up his headquarters staff. He kicked Chu Chi-jiao off the Aeronautical Commission and sent him to Kunming in the far western province of Yunnan, near the border with Burma. Chennault went with him to help him set up CAF flight schools. Chennault was not happy in Kunming. He was no longer part of Chiang's inner circle, and his health suffered in Yunnan's damp, chilly climate. But with the help of 18 other Americans, he set up primary, intermediate, and advanced flight schools around Yunnan province. The Imperial Japanese Army, numbering 750,000 men, pushed the Chinese west. Chiang moved his capital to Chongqing, about 500 miles northeast of Kunming.
Japan could never have conquered all of China. The Chinese could have just kept retreating, and there would never have been enough Japanese available to control the areas. And the Japanese were not interested in doing that. They were interested in controlling the areas that had resources that were useful to them, the ports and the arable areas.
As they retreated, the Chinese burned bridges, tore up roads, and blocked rivers behind them. The two sides settled into a stalemate, their armies separated by a 100-mile-wide no-man's land. Chongqing, a city of 200,000, swelled to 1 million souls as Chinese soldiers, officials, and refugees poured into it. In frustration, Tokyo ordered massive bombing raids against Chinese cities. In the world's first major bombing campaign against civilian targets, Imperial Japanese Army and Navy planes hit every major city in China and left millions of Chinese civilians dead, injured, and homeless.
It was probably counterproductive. It probably caused more ill will against the Japanese around the world than they gained from doing the bombing. But the Japanese at the time, if they had a weapon, they liked to use it.
Chiang avoided any full-scale land battles. His troops were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and often badly led. Warlords, whose loyalty to the nationalist government was in doubt, commanded many of his divisions. Chiang preferred to let his allies beat the Japanese, while he held back his own troops, saving them for a later fight against the Chinese communists. Chinese units did wage a brutal guerrilla war against the Japanese, and despite terrible losses, Chinese morale remained high. The Japanese In the spring of 1940, Hitler's Wehrmacht swept through Denmark, Norway, Holland, Luxembourg, and finally France. A British army sent to oppose the Germans was driven back to the beaches of Dunkirk, and a hasty retreat to England. In Europe, Britain now stood alone against Hitler's dreams of empire. In Washington, President Roosevelt began pushing a reluctant America toward aiding the British. Taking advantage of France's defeat, the Japanese occupied French Indochina with its vast resources of rubber and rice and a strategic airfield near Hanoi. By the summer of 1940, the Japanese were making daily bombing attacks on Chinese cities. Nearly 100 bombers hit Chongqing alone each day. In September, from their new base at Hanoi, Japanese bombers began striking at Kunming and other CAF training fields in Yunnan. Chennault's Chinese pilots were fighting valiantly. Chongqing was beyond the range of Japanese fighters, and the Mitsubishi Nell bombers were unescorted. Chinese fighters shot down 9 of the twin-engine bombers and damaged 300, a serious toll by Japanese standards. Fast, agile, and mounting 20mm cannons, the new escorts destroyed 13 Chinese fighters in one day. The new kid on the block was the Mitsubishi A6M-0. Chennault studied the Zero carefully and sent detailed descriptions to Washington. His dispatches were mostly ignored. Common wisdom declared that the Japanese were not capable of designing and building a superior fighter, but the Zero was far superior to Chinese fighters. It was equal or superior to America's frontline fighter planes. The Imperial Japanese fighters and bombers far outnumbered the small Chinese Air Force. The Generalissimo and Madame Chiang began pressuring the United States to provide high-performance aircraft and skilled American pilots to defend China. America was not yet at war with Japan, and the output of its aircraft factories was promised to England. But China and the Chiangs had powerful friends in Washington, D.C. Madame Chiang's brother, T.V. Soong, was China's top lobbyist in Washington. A Harvard graduate and a skilled diplomat, Soong was well-liked and well-respected in the American corridors of power. In communiques to Washington, Chiang Kai-Shek warned of the consequences of a Japanese victory in China. 500,000 Imperial Japanese troops, no longer needed on the continent, could sweep southward through the Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore to Australia. The situation was dire. Finally, in October of 1940, Chiang told Chennault, "You must go to the U.S."
China Air Force has been decimated. It's in name only. And they needed an instant Air Force if they were going to stay in the war.
Chennault went personally to General George Marshall, U.S. military chief, to secure Marshall's support for military aid.
I think that everybody realized that something had to be done for China. They didn't want Japan to be able to have a victory in China and not be occupied there and to be able to use its forces elsewhere. They wanted to supplement it. And so when there became an avenue to A, sell Curtiss airplanes, and B, provide aid to China, inexpensively, and also C, do it covertly, which sort of appealed to Roosevelt.
With the help of several influential Americans, including Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, soon arranged to buy more than 300 American-built aircraft for China. Britain agreed to release its claim on a shipment of Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighter planes in return for a more advanced version of the P-40. And in December, the deal was approved. 100 Curtiss P-40s to China by spring. soon also lobbied for Boeing B-17 bombers, but Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall said no. The B-17s would go to England.
They had hoped for, substantial amounts of airplanes. I think 500 airplanes was their goal. They finally wound up with, I think, less than 100, slightly less than 100, and those were not all immediately assembled. They got a few odds and ends, some bolty P-66s and a few other things that came in that were not useful to them. But as it turned out, he got enough P-40s that he could equip the AVG, but more importantly, he got the pilots.
To persuade the Chinese to buy the P-40s the U.S. was offering, Chennault took a Chinese delegation to Bowling Field near Washington, D.C., where, ironically, a young John Allison demonstrated the airplane with a show of aerobatics. The irony is, it was the same John Allison who would later win the Silver Star in the CBI Theater, flying for Tex Hill in the 23rd Fighter Group.
Tex Hill was one of the outstanding individuals. Tex was a very brave individual, lots of courage, also a good head for what was going to happen and what we wanted to happen and the best way to go about it. So I flew with Tex frequently in the setting up of missions, and then I flew with him also as a member of his fighter team. So I got to know him very well. He was completely honest, tried to do what Chennault wanted to do the way Chennault wanted it done.
And the Chinese official said, we need 100 of these airplanes. And Chennault said, no, you need 100 men like this.
The China lobby also persuaded President Roosevelt to allow Chennault to recruit pilots and ground crews from the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marines.
They made a decision that they would allow American flyers, military pilots, resign their commissions and become part of a volunteer group that would become a sort of foreign legion. And I think in the back of everybody's mind, there's the Lafayette Escadrille was there as an example.
And Chennault came back. He'd been out there since 1937. He came back, and Hap Arnold, George Marshall, Admiral Tower, Stimson, they were all against it. They said, it's just one of Chennault's pipe dreams.
American generals and admirals opposed any recruitment of their personnel, and Chennault was almost arrested at one naval base when he arrived to recruit pilots and mechanics. But letters signed by the military chiefs of staff were Chennault's trump cards, and the project went ahead. In December, Chennault also briefed Marshall personally about the Japanese Zero. Marshall was concerned. Chennault described a plane that was better than anything in the American arsenal. The general passed the information to the State Department and to military commanders, but it was scoffed at or ignored. The first batch of 35 P-40s left New York Harbor on the 19th of February, 1941, on a cargo ship bound down the Atlantic, around the Horn of Africa, and across the Indian Ocean to Rangoon. The voyage took 3 months. Each plane was in 2 crates, one for the fuselage and one for the single-piece wing. They came from the factory missing some key components that Chennault or his agents had to purchase separately. Allison engines from General Motors, radios from RCA, guns from the Colt Manufacturing Company, and gun sights from the U.S. Army. These were shipped with the second batch of aircraft. At Rangoon, much of the heavy lifting was done by hand. Mobs of Indian and Chinese workers muscled the crates onto trucks, then opened the crates and muscled the wings and fuselages to the assembly area, and the planes were towed 10 miles to Mingaladone Airport for final assembly. In the tropical sun, the planes became too hot to touch, so the assembly work was done under open-air thatched roof shelters. 2 of the planes were lost before they left the docks. One was missing so many parts it would never be airworthy. And a wing crate was accidentally dunked in the harbor. When it was opened 2 days later, salt corrosion had ruined the wing. Both planes were set aside for spare parts. The first of the P-40s was test flown on June 12th.
The P-40 was, in effect, a lash-up. It took the P-36 and they put an Allison engine on it and converted from the P-36 to the P-40. And it had a integral wing, a one-piece wing that was very, very strong, and that provided a lot of strength to its structure. So the P-40 was, the greatest quality was that it was available. It had been put into production, and there were a lot of them coming off the production lines, and pilots were familiar with it. And so it had the quality of speed of about 340, 350 miles an hour, which was not the fastest in the world, but competitive. Not the most maneuverable in the world, but strong, able to dive, and it had 650 caliber machine guns, which gave it a lot of firepower compared to the Japanese airplanes. And so Chennault knew this, and he devised the tactics of climb, dive, and zoom, and get above the Japanese formation, come to the Japanese formation shooting, dive away from it, and recover someplace else, and then make another attack. And in no cases do you dogfight with any of the Japanese fighters, which was absolutely the correct way to fight the airplane.
Recruiting for pilots and ground crews began in April. Chennault hired 3 recruiters for what was now known as the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. Skip Adair had come home from China after his CAF flight school in Yunnan was closed. Rutledge Irvine was a retired Navy commander, and Richard Allworth was an Army pilot who, rumor said, had flown with the Lafayette Escadrille before World War I. Officially, the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, CAMCO, set up by William Pauley of Curtiss Aircraft as a front for aid to the Chinese Air Force, hired AVG personnel. CAMCO's employment contracts were masterpieces of ambiguity. Pilots were offered $600 a month, $675 for flight leaders, plus a vague promise for a $500 bonus for every confirmed kill. Ground crewmen were offered $300 a month. These pay rates were far above U.S. military pay.
But we loaned the money to the Chinese, and they contracted with CAMCO to buy the airplanes, to pay the whole thing, to fund the whole operation. Do you know that our biggest cost of the $13 million for that year's operation? We bought our airplanes with that. We paid $7.5 million, $75,000 apiece for the P-40s. And the only reason we got them is because the British were promised the upgraded version of the P-40, and they cut 100 P-40B models off of their line, and they were to get the next generation P-40s. And so that's where we were able to get in business.
Some signed on for the money, some for adventure or for the chance to travel, some out of boredom with peacetime military duties. War with Germany was looming, and some pilots signed up for China because they believed fighting the Japanese would be less dangerous than fighting the Germans. The recruiters often claimed that the Japanese were poor pilots flying second-rate airplanes. Besides, some prospects were told, "You'll mostly be shooting down unarmed cargo planes." Chennault wanted qualified fighter pilots. He got some, but the rest were a mixed bag. Seaplane pilots with little time in land planes, and low-time pilots who inflated their flying experience. The quality of the recruits improved only after Chennault ordered his recruiters to be truthful and more selective. One of Allworth's recruits was Gregory Boyington, part Cherokee, and a 28-year-old Marine Corps lieutenant and a flight instructor at Pensacola. Boyington was a hard drinker and a scrappy brawler, qualities that would not always endear him to Chennault. Irvine's first two prospects were a pair of Navy dive bomber pilots, Eddie Rector and David Tex Hill.
We were stationed in Norfolk and walked into the ready room in operations there on shore, and there's Gus Whithelm. He said, "Here's some guys that'll go with you." He was our operations officer. We didn't even know what he was talking about, you know. And he introduced us as Commander Irvine. He said, Commander Irvine said, "We're looking for volunteers to keep the Burma Road open so supplies can flow into China." So I was anxious to get back anyway. Irvine made it very clear the contract was very lucrative that he explained to us, you know. But we did, in the Navy, you got a complete discharge. I mean, there wasn't any reserve status or anything. You lost a year's service. Of course, we eventually got it back, but at the time, the Navy washed their hands of all of the volunteers that came out of the Navy.
100 pilots signed up. 99 went to China. One pilot, Ajax Baumler, was held back. He had violated an earlier passport by fighting in the Spanish Civil War, where he shot down 6 German and Italian fighter planes. The first batch of 31 AVG personnel, ground crews, clerks, and a chaplain sailed from San Francisco in June and reached Rangoon on July 28th. The main group, 37 pilots, 84 ground crewmen and staff, and 2 female nurses, sailed on July 8th.
And I was on the second boat on the Bloemfontein, and very interesting trip over there. Half missionaries, half AVG people, and I don't know who converted who on that trip, I can tell you. But those missionaries had a fertile field to operate in, that's for sure. And we met a couple of heavy cruisers in Salt Lake City and the Northampton. And they were coming out of Australia when we were going in. And the ambassador met us. We went into Brisbane. But the funny thing about it is, the ambassador said, "Man," he said, "if I had a headache," he said, "I've been rounding up sailors here for a week." See, the diggers were all off fighting the war, you know, and the ratio of women was about 5 to 1 to one man. And when those sailors went ashore, man, these women swarmed on them. They thought they'd died and gone to heaven.
The liner and her escort slipped south of the equator toward Australia to avoid the Caroline and Marshall Islands occupied by the Japanese. They arrived in Singapore on August 11th, where the AVG contingent waited for transit to Rangoon. Chennault arrived back in Chongqing on July 18th, his Chinese DC-3 landing in the midst of a Japanese bombing raid. He took careful note of Japan's new G-4M Betty bombers and studied the wreckage of a Japanese Zero fighter shot down during the raid. Months earlier, Chiang Kai-Shek had asked for American fighters and pilots in part to protect Chongqing, his capital city. That help had not arrived in time. Imperial Japanese bombers pounded Chongqing again and again and again. But across the mountains, at airfields in Burma, an American Tiger was waking, and a legend was about to be born.
I don't think people have ever really understood the significance of that Salween mission. And now the people who were involved in that do, but none of the historians have really picked up on it and understand that this could have been an entirely different world, you know, if that mission had failed.
Summer 1941. The eyes of the Western world are on Europe. German armies had overrun much of the continent. President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act to aid Britain, which stood alone against Hitler's ambitions. The Western Allies paid little attention to events in Asia. Desperate for natural resources, especially coal and oil, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. Its occupation gradually spread into Greater China until 1937, when a skirmish at Beijing ignited a full-scale war. Imperial Japan's well-trained and well-equipped armies and air forces swept aside the Chinese defenders to occupy all of China's ports and major cities. The nationalist Chinese government, under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek, retreated to Yunnan province in far western China. In 1939, Japan invaded Indochina for its rich deposits of coal and oil. If China fell, all of Asia and the Western Pacific might fall to the Japanese sword. That year, Madame Chiang Kai-Shek hired Claire Chennault, a fighter pilot recently retired from the U.S. Army Air Corps, to train and lead China's struggling and outdated air forces. In Washington, war with Japan was looking increasingly likely. President Roosevelt gave Chennault permission to recruit 100 U.S. Army and Navy fighter pilots, along with ground crews, to fight for China as the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. Under provisions of the Lend-Lease Act, Chennault was given 100 P-40 Tomahawk fighter planes, just rolling off the Curtiss-Wright assembly lines. Living and working at primitive jungle airstrips, enduring shortages of planes, pilots, and supplies, and fighting against a vastly superior enemy, the AVG Flying Tigers would give the Japanese a series of staggering blows that would tip the balance in the war in China. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. The first American volunteer group of the Chinese Air Force was officially created on 1 August 1941 by order of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek. Pilots and ground staff began arriving in Burma from the States in early August by ship to Rangoon, then on the narrow-gauge Burma Railway to Kai Da Field at Taungoo, 175 miles north of Rangoon. What the newcomers found at Kai Da Field didn't please them. They griped about the tropical heat, the torrential rain, the millions of bugs, the primitive bamboo huts, the uncomfortable cots, and the British-supplied cigarettes and food. AVG chaplain Paul Frillman feared a mutiny.
It was a real harsh environment. Taungoo, the Brits wouldn't even be there. They'd move out of there in the summertime.
Butch Carney, who had been with Chennault in Yunnan, China, appointed 3 squadron leaders. Robert Sandy Sandell, a former Army flight instructor, got 1st Squadron. 2nd Squadron went to Jack Newkirk, a Navy fighter pilot from the carrier Yorktown. Arvid Olsen, a veteran P-40 pilot, got 3rd Squadron. Each squadron leader chose 12 pilots. Newkirk chose mostly Navy flyers. Olsen picked only Army pilots. With more pilots filtering in through August and September, Chennault began the task of turning them into an effective fighting unit. He established what came to be called Chennault's Kindergarten. Daily classes on geography, jungle survival, and most importantly, on tactics.
Training curriculum would be 60 hours of lecture, tactical lectures, and 60 hours of familiarization in the P-40. And of course, the Navy guys, we'd flown nothing but round engines, so, it was a challenge on the checkouts on those.
Forget everything the Army Air Corps has taught you about fighting, Chennault told the men. Instead, they were to adopt the battle-proven tactics used by the RAF in Britain. That meant 2 plane formations against fighters for maneuverability and mutual protection, and a 3-plane flight for firepower against bombers. The Japanese planes turn much faster than our Tomahawks, he told them. Never get into a turning fight with the Japanese. Hit their formations from above, out of the sun, to scatter and confuse them. Then pick them off one by one, he told them. These were the tactics the Japanese would try to use against the Americans, as described in a captured Japanese training manual. Japanese pilots, he told the men, were well trained and disciplined. They knew how to fly, and they knew how to shoot. But they could be beaten by hit-and-run diving attacks.
One of the characteristic things of all the leaders of all the air forces of the world, for the most part, was that they're wrong about almost everything they did. But you had a few people, like Claire Chennault and a few others, who had a journeyman's view of the problem. They looked at it not from some abstract WWII point of view, but from the standpoint of, I've got a tool in my hand, how do I use it? And if you were as an experienced fighter pilot, as Claire Chennault was, you knew exactly what climb and dive tactics would produce, you knew what turning tactics would produce, and you knew what the airplane in your inventory would produce. So he looked at the P-40 and he knew it was not a dogfighter, and he tailored his tactics to it, and it served beautifully.
He obviously knew a hell of a lot about the Japanese tactics, because after observing them in these tactical lectures, he was able to impart the things to us that actually is what really made us, were the tactics that he taught us. You see, the people down in the Pacific, they had the same airplanes we had, but they lost practically all of them. And the reason they did is because they did not use the tactics that Chennault taught us. And those tactics were sent back to the War Department, but they never disseminated to the guys down in the Pacific. But they were very simple, and I guess they thought they were so simple that it didn't mean anything.
Back in the States, some of the recruits had been told that they would mostly be shooting down unarmed Japanese transports. Some of them signed on with the AVG because they thought that fighting the Japanese would be safer than fighting the Germans. 2 of the pilots were killed in training accidents in September. At the end of the month, 7 pilots and a crew chief quit and sailed for home. Tex Hill, Eddie Rector, and 15 other pilots reached Tonggu on September 15th and were assigned to squadrons the following day. Navy pilots Hill and Rector went to the 2nd Squadron.
First time I met Chennault, I could never have been more impressed. I mean, the features on that guy, if you've ever seen pictures of Chennault, he's a craggy, wrinkle, and those black eyes, which come from somewhere. They must have some Indian blood in them somewhere back down that way. I know he's from French Huguenot background, but anyhow, he's the kind of guy that immediately instills confidence in you. I know that I was impressed where if it told me to go through that wall, I'd go. He was a great guy. He was very loyal to the people that worked for him. He had a lot of people above him that didn't like him because he made them look like Ned and the Third Reader.
More pilots arrived in October. Worried about a possible air attack on Kai Da Field from nearby Thailand, Chennault sent his 3 squadron leaders on a recon flight. Thailand was officially neutral, but it had almost certainly been penetrated by the Japanese. The 3 pilots scouted as far east as Chiang Mai, but saw no signs of the enemy.
We had no nav aids. Everything was dead rusting. The maps we had originally were French maps, and any relation between that map and the terrain would be a coincidence. And the first maps that we got that were any good were the first Japs we shot down. Then the Japs had pretty good maps. Then later on in 1943, of course, they mapped our country mapped the area and got very good maps then.
On 26 October, an unidentified aircraft flew over Kai-Da at 6,000 feet, and the next day, a group of 6 aircraft scouted the field from high altitude. AVG pilots scrambled, but their Tomahawks could not climb fast enough to catch the intruders. Chennault believed they were Japanese planes flying from Thailand. In fact, they were Mitsubishi Ki-15s flown from Hanoi, Vietnam, 600 miles to the east, sent by the Japanese Army Air Force to photograph airfields in Burma. Designed as a fast civilian mail plane, the Mitsubishi Ki-15 Wild Goose served the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy as a light attack bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. It was amazingly fast for an airplane with a fixed landing gear, with a top speed of 298 miles per hour. The Allies codenamed it Babs. November 3rd would be remembered as Circus Day at Kai-Da. 2 Tomahawks ran off the end of the runway, one of them a total loss. 2 pilots taxied their planes into parked aircraft. Another pilot hit the brakes and stood his P-40 on its nose, while 2 hapless mechanics sat on its wings. 7 planes damaged in one day. 2 days later, Ed Conant, a veteran Navy flying boat pilot with little time in land planes, cracked up another P-40, his 3rd in a week. 2 more, the mechanics said, would make Conant a Japanese ace. Chennault sent an angry letter to his stateside recruiters, demanding that they weed out the timid and incompetent. 26 more pilots arrived in mid-November, among them a feisty, hard-drinking Marine fighter pilot named Greg Boyington.
It was just real primitive. But our guys adjusted to that. You know, the environment we were in, our guys were very resourceful, and Chennault didn't put a lot of restrictions on us. He just told us to let us use what ingenuity we had and go out and kill as many Japs as we could.
A few days after they arrived, one of the new pilots was flipping through a magazine and saw a photo of a British P-40 with a shark's mouth painted on its nose. He showed it to his squadron mates, and they asked Chennault for permission to adopt it as their squadron marking. Chennault said it should be the group's emblem. Within a week, every Tomahawk on the field had a shark's face. It looked, said one pilot, mean as hell. Squadron emblems also appeared. The first squadron chose a green apple and a uniformed Adam chased by a naked Eve, symbolizing the first pursuit, nickname Adam and Eve's. Second squadron's planes sported a black and white panda, the symbol of China. And third squadron, Hell's Angels, chose a bright red nude with wings and a halo. Every plane also carried the insignia of the Chinese Air Force, a white 12-pointed star. The last group of AVG personnel, 4 pilots and 9 flight instructors, reached Burma on November 25th. The pilots went to Kai-Da. The instructors were sent to Yunnan, China, to train Chinese Air Force pilots. November also brought promises of greater support for the AVG. More planes, more spares, more supplies, more pilots and ground crews. In Washington and London, everyone who mattered now understood that the war with Japan was coming. The British offered Chennault a squadron of Brewster Buffalo fighters from Singapore, along with their pilots and ground crews. And there were promises of British and American bombers. The Brewster Buffalo was the U.S. Navy's first monoplane fighter. Introduced in 1939, it never lived up to its promises. By early 1941, the Buffalo was already considered obsolete, outperformed by the new Grumman F-4F Wildcat and by most Japanese and German fighters. By the first week of December 1941, the American Volunteer Group had 60 combat-ready P-40s at Kai-Da Field. 3 more pilots quit, leaving 82 pilots on the AVG roster in Burma.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Without warning, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Wake Island. From his headquarters in Kunming, Chennault immediately put the AVG on a war footing. He assigned the 3rd Squadron, Olson's Hell's Angels, as the assault squadron, armed, fueled, and on alert. 2 days later, an alert at 3:30 a.m. sent 4 P-40s into the air. It was a false alarm. Landing in the dark, Tex Hill overshot the runway. His mates found him standing dazed near his wrecked Tomahawk, with an unlit cigarette in one hand and an unlit match in the other, his clothing soaked in gasoline.
It was true that we were mercenaries, but then when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, then we were involved. Our country was involved in the war. And what brought us together is that it was necessity, you know. It was teamwork. We had a hardcore that had flown together. We didn't have people rotating through us. We're all in the same boat over there for this year.
The British asked Chennault for a squadron to help protect Rangoon's harbor and its airport at Ming Aladan, both staging points for supplying British forces in Singapore. On Thursday, December 12th, the 18 Tomahawks of the 3rd Squadron, the Hell's Angels, left Kai-Da and flew to Ming Aladan. Their ground crews, support staff, and 3 more pilots traveled by truck or train to Rangoon. In mid-December, Brigadier General John Magruder sent a message to Chennault asking him and his pilots to return to the U.S. military. The question of Chennault's rank was left open. Chennault was not unwilling to return to the Army, but he wanted the rank of general. He sent a message to Madame Chiang Kai-Shek asking her opinion. There would be advantages to making the AVG a U.S. Army unit, he told Madame Chiang, in aircraft, supplies, reinforcements, and discipline. The only disadvantage, he said, was that a commander might replace him with less experience in China. Kai-Da Field was less than 100 miles from the Thai border and barely 300 from Chiang Mai, Thailand's 2nd largest city. With no effective early warning system, Chennault worried that Kai-Da was too vulnerable to a Japanese airstrike. He sent out P-40s to look for Japanese planes in and around Chiang Mai. The patrol found nothing, but Chennault was still jumpy. He wired Chung King, asking to move the AVG out of Burma, back to China. Madame Chiang replied that the AVG could leave Kai-Da and move to Kunming, but that the Hell's Angels would have to stay at Ming Aladan, near Rangoon. Kai-Da would be manned as a backup field and repair station between Rangoon and Kunming. The P-40s of the 1st and 2nd Squadrons, 34 planes in all, flew the 700 miles to Kunming on December 17th, arriving just hours after Japanese bombers hit the city. Most of the AVG ground crews and supplies traveled by truck over the Burma Road to China, a slow and dangerous journey even after the road had been widened and leveled in 1940. It took them 2 weeks to reach Kunming.
What Chennault did, he had in every village in the areas that we operated on, he had people who had radios. They either had mostly CW, die-to-die-dit, but they had these lookouts in every village. So when we'd move into a base, like this would be the map, take the map, and this would be the base we're going to operate out of. Then you draw concentric circles on out to 300 kilometers. And so when all these villages would have to do, any village that heard something, like engine noise, I hear engine noise, and put a flag right on that village. And pretty soon, you wouldn't believe it, but pretty soon these flags began to line up, and you knew they were coming in. It was so accurate. And we knew, and when we had hit that 150-kilometer circle, well, that's when we'd launch, and that would give us time to get to 18, 20,000, which was our best altitude. And they'd be there. And the other thing that stood us in good stead with that system was if a guy got lost, which is real easy to do, first village you'd come to, you'd get scattered, you know, in a fight or something. You'd come down over that village and shoot a short burst. That information would go immediately back into your base. Well, you didn't know where you were, but the base knows where that village is. When they give you a vector, then you can come in on it. It's real simple, but by God, it was effective.
Three days after the P-40s arrived in Kunming, Chennault's early warning net reported Japanese bombers coming from Vietnam. First Squadron took to the air, 16 P-40s, and turned southwest to intercept the bombers. Second Squadron flew backup. While 4 of the Pandas stayed close to Kunming, 4 others patrolled the northwest to catch any bombers attacking in a hook approach. Jack Newkirk, leading the group northwest, spotted a formation of 10 bombers below him, with no fighter escort. They were Kawasaki Ki-48s of the 21st Hikkatai based at Hanoi. Introduced in 1939, the Ki-48 was fast and maneuverable, but carried a light bomb load. With no armor and only 3 machine guns, it was vulnerable to attack. In Burma, it was often used as a dive bomber. Its allied code name was Lily. Newkirk's P-40s dove out of the sun, firing at the Lilies from far out of range. The bombers jettisoned their loads, turned tail, and ran. Newkirk led his Pandas back to Kunming. A few minutes later, the Adam and Eves spotted the same group of Lily bombers south of Kunming. Sandel ordered 2 pilots to fly top cover. The P-40s attacked the bombers from every direction in a disorganized melee. They seemed to have forgotten all of Chennault's lessons about hit-and-run attacks, 2-plane formations, and Japanese tactics. The 2 pilots flying top cover also ignored their instructions and joined the fight. The enemy formation was a Diamond 4, flanked by 2 Vs of 3. The right-hand V was hit first by a mass of P-40s, and all 3 Lilies were shot down. The AVG was credited with 4 Lilies, at the cost of 1 P-40. Heading home, Eddie Rector ran out of fuel and bellied into a field near Kunming. Japanese records for the flight show 3 Lilies lost and 7 damaged, including some that crash-landed at Hanoi. 14 airmen died on the mission. For the Japanese unit, it was their worst bloody nose in a long time. Shaken by the loss of 30% of the planes, and a third of the airmen on a single raid, the 21st Hikkotai never returned to Kunming. The people of Kunming greeted the AVG pilots as heroes. For months, the city had endured near constant bombing by the Japanese. The Americans had driven off the attackers and saved the city from another dose of devastation.
You can't believe how grateful they were. Those poor people had been bombed all these years, you know, and just killed thousands. I mean, just the cities used them as a target.
Chinese civilians saved many Allied pilots who were shot down in China in spite of cruel and severe reprisals by the Japanese.
You know, the guerrillas were the Chinese communists. They never committed any large forces or anything, but they joined together with the nationalists against a common enemy. And they were the guys, they were responsible for saving a lot of our troops. Unless you just fell right on top of the Japanese, right, they'd get you out of there. The Chinese people are just such wonderful people, really. I mean, a Chinese friend is the best friend you'll ever have.
In America, a nation hungry for good news of the war and desperate for heroes, Time magazine picked up the story and christened the AVG as the Flying Tigers. The name was probably suggested months before by one of the young men working in Washington, D.C. on the AVG's behalf. Back at Kunming, Chennault was not pleased by the Tigers' performance. He sat them down, listed off their mistakes one by one, and told them, next time, get 'em all. At Ming Aladan, the AVG 3rd Squadron was joined by 34 British Buffaloes and 4 Blenheim bombers, but only half of the Buffaloes were combat ready. With no real reserve closer than Kunming, 900 miles to the northeast, Olson's Hells Angels began calling themselves the Lost Squadron. On December 23rd, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force struck Rangoon. From airfields at Bangkok, Thailand, and Phnom Penh, Cambodia, 60 Ki-21 heavy bombers took off for Burma without fighter escort. The Mitsubishi Ki-21 carried more than a ton of bombs, 6 machine guns, and a crew of 5 to 7 men. It was used with great success in China, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Allied codename Sally. 15 Sallies were headed for the airfield at Ming Aladan. They were to be joined by Mitsubishi Ki-30 light bombers, Allied codename Anne, escorted by Ki-27 fighters, codenamed Nate. The 3 groups were supposed to rendezvous over Thailand and strike Rangoon in one large formation, but their timing was off, and the attackers reached the city in 3 separate waves. The Sallies came first, in tight V of V's formation. A few miles behind them came the Anns, escorted by a disorganized gaggle of Nates. About a dozen P-40s rose to meet the attackers. RAF Buffaloes damaged 1 bomber before the Tomahawks joined the battle. In the melee that followed, 2 Tomahawks were shot down. Paul Green bailed out and survived. 5 of the Sallies were shot down. 1/3 of the formation, with the loss of 30 crewmen. South of Rangoon, 6 other Hells Angels faced a tight formation of 18 Sallies heading for the oil refinery at Syrium. Leading one 3-plane flight, Neil Martin's P-40 was caught in a hail of fire from the Sallies' machine guns and went down in flames. 2 of the Sallies were shot down. A 3rd group of 27 bombers hit Rangoon, killing more than 1,000 people, mostly civilians. One of those bombers crashed on the way home. It was another bloody nose for the Japanese. At the end of the day, they had lost 7 bombers, with many more damaged, though the Allied claims were higher. Japanese pilots and gunners claim to have destroyed 43 Allied fighters that day. In fact, the RAF lost 5 Buffaloes with their pilots, and the AVG lost 3 planes and 2 pilots. On Christmas Day, the Japanese struck at Rangoon, launching a mass formation of 63 bombers escorted by 25 fighters. Again, their battle plan came apart, splitting the attackers into 3 groups. At Ming Aladan, there were only 12 Tomahawks and 14 Buffaloes ready for battle against an armada of 88 enemy planes. 2 AVG replacement pilots arrived from Kai-Da on Christmas Eve with a truckload of ammunition. As the Japanese formation crossed into Burma, Olson sent his Hell's Angels up to meet them. The first fight occurred over Syrium, south of Rangoon. 20 Sallies, escorted by 15 Hayabusas, were heading home after bombing the city. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa was one of Japan's most successful fighters. Highly maneuverable, Ki-43s shot down more Allied aircraft than any other Japanese fighter, and most of Japan's aces flew Ki-43s, Allied codename Oscar. 7 P-40s tore into the Japanese formation, 7 against 35. They shot down 12 bombers and 3 fighters, which they mistakenly identified as Zeros. 2 P-40s crash-landed, but both pilots escaped with minor injuries. North of the city, the RAF and the rest of the AVG tangled with a much larger mass of bombers and fighters. Leading a fight of 3 P-40s, Parker Dubois dove on a Hayabusa. Overtaking the enemy fighter, he rolled sharply to avoid ramming it. His wingtip sliced through the Oscar's wing, severing it at the root, and the Oscar spun away. Dubois landed with 4 feet missing from his own wing. The Allies claimed 28 Japanese planes destroyed on Christmas Day. Japanese records put their losses at about half that number. In the chaos of aerial combat, several pilots or gunners might claim the same kill, each thinking it was his own. The excitement, the panic, the adrenaline, and the confusion of combat made such errors inevitable. On Christmas Day, the Japanese pilots and gunners who attacked Rangoon claimed a whopping 38 Allied fighters shot down. Half again the total number of Allied fighters in the air. Actual Allied losses were 2 Tomahawks and 5 Buffaloes. The men at Ming Aladan were nervous and worn out. In less than 2 weeks, the Hell's Angels had lost a quarter of their pilots, dead, wounded, or missing. Their planes were badly shot up. Leaflets dropped by Japanese planes warned of an airborne invasion. Olson wired Chennault, send reinforcements or move the squadron to Kunming. Chennault assigned Newkirk's 2nd Squadron to reinforce Hell's Angels at Rangoon. Then he sent an appeal to President Roosevelt for more fighters and pilots, and for 36 twin-engine bombers with American crews to form the 2nd American Volunteer Group. The president responded with a promise of more pilots and 50 of the new Curtiss P-40E Kitty Hawks.
The AVG had several follow-ups in the concept, and the 2nd AVG, they had a bomb group, and they had 3 more fighter groups. But they didn't get any further than Australia, and they stopped them there because the war was going on, and they needed them down there, and they never got to China.
At Rangoon, in the days after Christmas, the pilots braced for another Japanese attack. But the skies were quiet. The Japanese fighters and bombers were standing down and licking their wounds. On December 31, General Magruder sent a cable to Washington recommending that the AVG should become the 23rd Fighter Group, despite the AVG's unquestioned success in its first 3 battles. Magruder offered a very negative assessment of the unit's potential. Unless it was completely reorganized with U.S. Army officers, enlisted men, and logistics support, the AVG could have little military value. Newkirk's Panda Bears, including Tex Hill, all arrived in Rangoon by New Year's Day. Frustrated that no Japanese planes were rising up to fight, Newkirk decided to take the fight to the enemy. The target was a small airfield about 50 miles inside Thailand, near the village of Tak. 4 Pandas took off from Ming Aladan before dawn on January 3rd. Newkirk led the mission with Bert Quisman on his wing. Hill flew on Howard's wing. The Pandas arrived at sunup to find 9 Nate fighters idling on the ground, like sitting ducks. Unknown to the Pandas, the Nates were just returning from their own pre-dawn mission.
We were going over there and going to surprise the guys. Went out there at daylight and catch them on the field. Well, unfortunately, we forgot to look up. Bert Quisman had engine trouble. He had to turn back. So there were 3 of us in string headed down to straight to these field of the airplanes that were lined up. Well, first thing I know, this guy slid in between me and Howard. And I was just, I'm right behind this guy. And I was so excited that I didn't even bother to look through the sight. We had a ring and bead sight on the airplane. But the way our ammo was loaded was every 5th round was an incendiary. So it looked just like a hose coming out. I just was just right behind this guy. I wasn't no 50 yards. And he just blew up. But simultaneously, a guy I didn't see made an overhead pass on me, and he shot 33 holes in my airplane. I never saw him. Just when I pulled off this guy, just shot down, I'm pulling into another guy coming this way head on. When he shot head on, these little I-97s, they had what was equivalent to about a 30 caliber, 7.7 or something like that. And those bullets stuck in the prop. And when it did, well, I threw my prop out of balance. Well, I throttled back and got down, and we were scattered at that time and separated, and I came on back to Rangoon. And I got there, and Jim Howard came in, and Newkirk. Newkirk had shot down 2 airplanes. Jim had gotten these on the ground. He didn't even know this. Other guy got on his tail. I said, you go look at your airplane. I went over there, and he had 11 bullet holes in his airplane.
Early the next morning, the Japanese struck back at Rangoon with Nate fighters and AN bombers. The Nates shot down 3 Pandas, though all survived. It was the Japanese' first clear victory over the AVG. So began a pattern of daylight raids by the P-40s against Japanese airfields in Thailand, and pre-dawn raids by the Japanese against Rangoon's airfields. In mid-January, hard-pressed American and Filipino troops were preparing for a last stand on the Bataan Peninsula. Foreseeing victory in the Philippines, the Japanese transferred 2 Nate squadrons and 2 bomber groups, about 75 aircraft, from the Philippines to China and Burma. General Sugawara Michio commanded the Japanese air forces in the region. In Malaysia and Singapore, his bombers could operate with little or no opposition. But in Burma, his losses were staggering, and he had no taste for more. He left a small force in Thailand and transferred most of his fighters and bombers to other, less troublesome battlefronts. Although Newkirk's Pandas were well outnumbered by the Japanese, they gave better than they got. Before long, 2nd Squadron could only put 10 P-40s against the much larger Japanese raids. On January 16th, the ground crews and staff of 3 British Hurricane squadrons docked at Rangoon. With these reinforcements, Rangoon appeared secure. But the Japanese Imperial Army had other plans. At the end of 1941, the Japanese were pushing south through Malaysia, driving the British and Commonwealth troops ahead of them. In the Philippines, American and Filipino units were retreating under the Japanese onslaught. Beyond Malaysia, Australia lay open to Emperor's armies. From New Guinea, the Japanese could threaten not only Australia, but the main British and American supply routes to East Asia. To the west lay India, Britain's greatest colony. If India fell, Japan could reach the oil fields of the Mideast and link its Asian empire with Germany in the west. But to reach India, the Japanese had to cross Burma, a country protected by mountain ranges like fortress walls. The British believed that their navy could protect Burma from an attack from the sea, and that the mountains would protect it from an attack over land. But on January 19th, far down the narrow tail of Burma that runs along the Malay Peninsula, a small Japanese detachment overran the airfield at Tavoy, 300 miles south of Rangoon. And the next day, 35,000 Japanese troops entered Burma near Tak, east of Rangoon. Abandoning their trucks for pack horses, the Japanese 55th Division had crossed the mountains on foot to invade Burma. The British Burma Division had 18,000 soldiers on paper, but its fighting corps was just 4,000 British and Indian troops against 35,000 Japanese.
The Japanese had to conserve their forces, and so they knew they couldn't occupy every square mile of China, so they took the best real estate all down the coast, all the ports. And this meant that the Chinese were then fighting without any external means of support, except for the one supply line that ran through Burma.
The Burma Road was China's only remaining link to its allies. If the Japanese could capture Burma and cut the fragile lifeline, China would stand or fall alone.
And I've always said that if he had put out his hand and said, "How do you do? Will you marry me?" I would have said, "How do you do? Yes, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Tex was a big deal because he'd been in Life and Time and a lot of magazine, a lot of newspaper stories about the Flying Tigers. And John Wayne had made a movie and played Tex's part in that movie, and that was early in 1942. So he was, you know, the town was excited about having the Reverend Sam Hill's brother come into town.
January 1942. The armed forces of Imperial Japan are advancing throughout Asia and the Pacific. Nearly 1 million Japanese forces occupy China's coastal ports and bomb her inland cities. In an uneasy alliance, the nationalist and communist Chinese fight a guerrilla war against the invaders. From their bases in China, Indochina, and Thailand, Japanese forces are advancing south along the Malay Peninsula to New Guinea. If New Guinea falls, the Japanese can threaten the Allies' Pacific supply lines, and without Allied arms and supplies, Australia would be cut off, and the main line of defense against Japanese aggression would move to the west coast of the United States. At Rangoon, in Burma, in early 1942, a small group of American fighter pilots is fighting back against the Japanese, far outnumbered by their enemy. The American Volunteer Group, commanded by Claire Chennault, is destroying Japanese bombers and fighters in the air and on the ground.
We're the first guys that defeated the Japanese. And that's why there's a lot of focus on us, because we were losing everywhere, you know. And it's just like the Doolittle raid, you know. It was a morale thing. It's just like the John Wayne movie, corny as it was. It was a timely movie, and people needed to get a hold of something, because these were real dark days in our history. And we're the first guys that ever defeated them. They were rolling over everybody.
The Allies need China to stay in the war, to tie down 500,000 Japanese occupation troops, and to provide a base from which to strike at the Japanese homeland. A single supply route from India through Burma to Kunming is China's only remaining lifeline to the West. If the Japanese cut that lifeline, China will fall. The Burma Road is the key. And for a few critical months in 1942, the American volunteer group stands virtually alone against the Japanese. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. Through the spring of 1942, the military forces of Imperial Japan appeared unstoppable, and on nearly every other battlefront around the world, Allied forces were digging in or falling back. The British believed Burma was safe. The British Navy stood guard against any seaborne invasion from the south. Britain's Burma Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Howard Alexander, had a fighting force of just 4,000 British and Indian troops, but Alexander believed it was sufficient. The Japanese had forces across the border in Thailand, but along the border was a rugged, nearly trackless rampart of mountain ranges. No army, said Alexander, could cross that barrier in force. The Japanese would prove him wrong. On January 19th, 300 miles south of Rangoon, on Burma's long tail that stretches down the Malay Peninsula, Japanese troops slipped across the mountains, overran the Allied airfield at Tavoy, and began moving north, sweeping the opposition aside. The next day, the main invasion force, 35,000 Japanese troops, entered Burma 100 miles east of Rangoon. They advanced quickly toward the city through the jungle the British thought was impassable. When the Japanese forced a crossing at the Sitang River, Rangoon's last defensive line, Alexander abandoned the port city and moved his Burma division north to try to block the Japanese on the road to Mandalay. While the battle was lost on the ground, the Flying Tigers were mauling the Japanese in the air. Throughout the Japanese advance, the AVG shot down Japanese fighters and bombers and strafed and bombed the Japanese ground forces. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill praised the AVG for its fierce defense of Rangoon, comparing it to the Royal Air Force and its defense of the British Isles. The victories they have won over the paddy fields of Burma may well prove comparable in character, if not in scope, to those won over the orchards and hop fields of Kent in the Battle of Britain. The AVG suffered few losses compared to the mauling they were inflicting on the Japanese, but one loss in particular hit them hard. In mid-March, Jack Newkirk led 10 P-40s to raid Chiang Mai and Lampang, two heavily defended Japanese airfields in Thailand. 2 nights before the raid, Newkirk told Tex Hill that he feared the mission would be his last. Hill offered to take his place, but Newkirk said no. At Chiang Mai, Newkirk's raiders caught the Japanese flat-footed and destroyed several aircraft on the ground, despite a storm of anti-aircraft fire. At Lampang, as Robert Keaton pulled his fighter out of a strafing dive, he saw a fireball blast 100 yards through the jungle below. It was Newkirk's P-40.
Newkirk, and he had a premonition. I had 2 guys that had premonitions, and he was one of them. And he sat down and wrote that letter that night and said if anything happens to him, he'd like for me to have that squadron. Chennault honored that. And I brought Ed Rector up as my vice squadron leader.
Chiang Kai-Shek sent 3 divisions of the Chinese Army to Burma under the command of U.S. Army General Joseph Stilwell to try to halt the Japanese advance and protect the Burma Road. But Stilwell's efforts were frustrated by a stream of contradictory orders from Chiang and by the Chinese troops, who were poorly led and reluctant to fight. The Japanese advanced northward, and the Allied retreat became a rout as British, Indian, Chinese, and Burmese soldiers and civilians fled along the escape routes to India and China. The Japanese overran Taungoo in early April, capturing intact the crucial bridge across the Sitang River near Burma's east border with China. Tex Hill's 2nd Squadron was stationed at Loy Wing, about 75 miles north of Lashio. They had been flying missions in support of the Chinese divisions fighting in Burma. Their airstrikes against Japanese columns and truck convoys were successful, but did little to slow the enemy's advance.
I was a senior guy, and I had to make a call. That's that picture up there. I had a real burden because we had lost all of our early warning system. And the Japs came in just at daylight, and I was going on a different mission. I stepped up on the side of my airplane, and I looked up and I saw these 8 fighters peeling off, coming down, and just stepped down off the airplane, and they were coming right over there where I actually fired a pistol at them. If I'd had enough lead on the guy, very easily knocked one down with the pistol. They were that close.
The next day, 29 April, the Japanese 56th Division captured Lashio, the end of the rail line from Rangoon and the western terminus of the Burma Road. The Chinese 6th Division, in a desperate fighting retreat, was virtually destroyed as a fighting unit. Alexander ordered all Allied personnel to leave Burma. Hill needed to evacuate his squadron to Pao Shan, an airfield on the Burma Road east of the Salween River, about 125 miles into China, but the weather at Loy Wing was socked in and the Japanese were not far away.
There's a trail from Lashio, a jungle trail that they could come up. So I figured on a forced march they could be there in a day. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened to that base. We had no defense at all as far as ground personnel.
A jungle trail led from Loy Wing to a point on the Burma Road a few miles east of the Japanese advance. Hill prepared to send his men, pilots, and ground crew up that trail to join the mass of refugees heading for China. As he was about to give the order, the fog lifted to 800 feet. Only a handful of the Panda Bear fighters were flyable. Before they left, the crews set fire to 22 precious P-40s that were waiting for repairs.
And we got out and got into Pao Shan, and the mass of humanity, the only way you could travel is on that road. I mean, you couldn't get off either side. And this mass of refugees stacked in there is unbelievable.
A few days later, Chennault called Hill and the rest of his squadron back to Kunming. The Japanese drove north, threatening to trap the Allied forces in western Burma, including the commander, General Stilwell. From his headquarters at Shuibo, west of Lashio, Stilwell led his staff west toward India. The Japanese were rushing to cut off all escape routes. Stilwell set a grueling pace of 14 miles a day over steep and rugged mountain trails. Cut off from the world, listed as missing in action, the 59-year-old general led the column on a 10-day trek to safety without the loss of a single life. The Burma Road was China's only lifeline to the west, and now it, too, was blocked. It was critical to the Allies that China should remain in the war. Nearly half of Japan's army, some 750,000 men, were fighting in China, holding the coastal cities against Chinese counterattacks and exploiting China's vast natural resources. If China sued for peace, Japan could shift its troops in China to battlefronts in the Pacific Islands, Malaysia, and Burma. The Emperor's armies could threaten Australia. They could attack India, Britain's most important colony in the region. Grinding across India to the Middle East, Japan might forge a geographical link with its principal ally, Nazi Germany.
That's sort of a what-if proposition, that what if the Japanese had pushed on through India and India had come to their sides as certainly the Japanese had hoped and certainly some of the Indians had hoped, and the Germans on their hand had broken through the Suez Canal and linked up with the Japanese. Actually, I think that had that happened, both nations have been so exhausted that they would have probably collapsed because it was really beyond their reach. But there was a danger that the Japanese might get to India, and there were two types of people who opposed the British. There were the Gandhi types, who were nonviolent, and then there was a Chandra Bose, who it's spelled B-O-S-E, but it's pronounced something like Boucher. And they were violent. They wanted to use arms against the British. So it's conceivable that there could have been a link up there, and they could have gotten some help from the Indians. Japan had an opportunity early in the war, perhaps, to make a thrust into India, and they elected not to because of British resistance. Also, I don't know that the Indian population would have responded to Japan any more readily than they were responding to the British. I don't think they wanted to trade one conqueror for another. There was an element in India under Bose who were wanting independence for India and who subsequently collaborated with the Axis. But as a mass uprising of the Indian people or a mass movement of the Indian people against the British, I just don't see it happening.
China's supply line had to stay open. With all land and sea routes blocked, the Allies proposed a daring plan to supply China by air. The task was assigned to the United States 10th Air Force. The U.S. Army Air Force had no experience creating a continuous airlift, an air bridge, so it called on officers who had experience with the new Air Corps Ferrying Command or with civilian air carriers. On 8 April 1942, launching from the RAF airfield at Dinjan in India's Assam state, 2 borrowed DC-3s carried 8,000 gallons of aviation fuel for the Flying Tigers, the first trip over the Himalayas to Kunming, China. By the end of April, the Army Air Force had established a more or less regular air service between India and China. With a ragtag fleet of 27 aircraft, they hauled in supplies and brought out wounded. Pilots flying the hump from India to China faced winds of up to 200 miles per hour, violent turbulence, aircraft icing, and instrument weather conditions. With cargo loads far above their rated weights, the C-47s and DC-3s clawed their way to altitude, skirting mountains that soared to 25,000 feet.
The men who flew what we now call the hump were extraordinary in that every flight could have wound up as a fatality by something as simpler as a bird strike into your carburetor, taking out one engine, because they were forcing the airplanes that they had, and initially largely C-47s, later C-46s, to fly almost at their maximum capability. To fly at that altitude, you had to use a supercharger on the C-47 engines, and that's a laborious process that you go through, and you feel as you do it that you just hope the engine keeps running because you've got to make the control manipulations in a certain way. But you're flying at an altitude in which the air is thin, you're on oxygen, and the weather can be suddenly catastrophic. And the losses were terrible. They would lose airplanes and with no hope of recovery. I mean, you didn't land in a meadow and somebody flew a helicopter in to rescue you. You went into a mountain peak and were killed. And they called it, as you know, the aluminum trail because of so many aircraft crashes across it.
In March 1942, Allied Command designated the Far East as the China-Burma-India Theater, or CBI, under the command of General Joseph Stilwell. But the European and Pacific theaters of war would continue to get the lion's share of men, materials, and press coverage. By late April, the Japanese controlled most of Burma. British forces were fleeing to India. The Chinese forces in Burma were scattered and on the run. The Japanese had captured Lashio, the western end of the Burma Road, and the road lay open to China and Kunming. 400 miles beyond Kunming lay Chongqing, China's capital and Chiang Kai-Shek's headquarters. At Lashio, in Burma, the 56th Red Dragon Armored Division, an elite Japanese unit, was fat with captured supplies and ready to strike. If the Japanese chose to drive east toward Chongqing, only weak forces would oppose them. Chongqing would fall, and with it, all of China. In early May, the 56th Armored Division turned eastward. Chennault sent reconnaissance flights down the Burma Road from Kunming. His pilots reported that the Japanese armored column was moving toward the Salween River, slowed only by mobs of refugees and fleeing Chinese soldiers. On 4 May, the Japanese vanguard was near the west bank of the Salween River. East of the river, the road to Kunming lay open to the invaders. Chennault was seriously alarmed. He knew the power of the 56th Armored Division, and he knew that if Kunming fell, the AVG's supply line over the Himalayas from India would be cut off. The transport planes flying over the hump could reach Kunming, but Chongqing was out of range. And without that supply line, the AVG could not fight, and China would fall.
Essentially, Japan could never have conquered all of China. The Chinese could have just kept retreating, and there would never been enough Japanese available to control the areas. And the Japanese were not interested in doing that. They were interested in controlling the areas that had resources that were useful to them, the ports and the arable areas.
But if the Chinese lay down their arms, Japan could shift vast armies out of China to the Pacific Islands, Malaysia, and the Indian frontier. The Salween River is one of the longest free-flowing rivers in the world. It tumbles 1,750 miles from glaciers high on the Tibetan Plateau through China, Burma, and Thailand to the Andaman Sea. It is an untamed river, navigable only in the last 50 miles from its mouth. From China into central Burma, it flows through the Grand Canyon of the East, a magnificent gorge up to 13,000 feet deep. Where the Burma Road crosses the Salween, the canyon is several miles wide and a mile deep. From the canyon's west rim, the Burma Road plunges down 20 miles of narrow, tortuous switchbacks to reach the Hoi Ting Bridge across the river. From the east bank, the road climbs another 20 miles of switchbacks to escape the canyon. On 4 May, the head of the Japanese column reached the west bank of the Salween River. Chennault knew the Japanese advance had to be stopped, and the Salween was the place to stop it. But he was reluctant to send the AVG to bomb and strafe the enemy column without orders from Chongqing. The Japanese armored column was moving up the Burma Road between lines of fleeing civilians and unarmed Chinese soldiers. An aerial attack would kill or injure scores, if not hundreds, of the helpless refugees crowded along the road. There was little choice. If the Japanese were to be stopped, Chennault's fighters had to attack. But Chennault did not want to make that decision alone. From Kunming on 6 May, he sent an urgent telegram to Madame Chiang Kai-Shek. "I consider the situation desperate," he told Madame Chiang. If the Japanese crossed the Salween, they could drive to Kunming in their captured Chinese trucks. The Burma Road and its bridges must be destroyed, he told her. The Japanese advance must be blocked. That same day, Chennault sent 6 Tupolev bombers to strike Japanese truck convoys that were heading toward the Salween from the west. Deep in the gorge, the remnants of the Chinese 36th Division failed to stop the Japanese at the river. Chinese soldiers blew up the bridge, then fled. A few advance elements of the Red Dragon Division crossed the Salween, but the main column was halted, waiting for an engineer battalion to erect a pontoon bridge that would carry its tanks, trucks, armored cars, and artillery across the water. From the west bank, the huge column stretched up the 20 miles of switchbacks to the plateau and beyond, to the west. Madame Chiang replied to Chennault's telegram early the next day, the 7th of May. she ordered him to attack the Japanese column with all available AVG. Immediately, Chennault ordered Tex Hill to attack the vehicles on the west wall of the gorge. Hill chose 3 other pilots from his Panda Bear squadron: Ed Rector, Frank Lawler, and Tom Jones, all ex-Navy pilots.
On May the 7th, when I was asked to lead a mission, the Chinese had blown the bridge, the main bridge there, but the Japanese had started building a pontoon bridge across. So I took a force of 8 planes. 4 of us were Navy guys that come out of a dive bombing squadron. And we were loaded up with these big Russian bombs of 550 pounds roughly, and some frags on the wings.
The P-40 is not a dive bomber. A bomb released in a near vertical dive would hit the plane's propeller before it hit the target. Most of the Flying Tigers P-40s weren't even equipped to carry bombs. But a month earlier, 1st Squadron had received a few of the new P-40E models, equipped with bomb shackles. The AVG mechanics had modified a few of the older P-40Bs so their belly tank shackles could carry 550-pound bombs. Hill and his companions took off that morning carrying fragmentation bombs and heavy demolition bombs. 4 P-40Bs from Arvid Olsen's Hell's Angels squadron flew top cover for Hill's fighter bombers. The 8 fighters flew the 200 miles to the Salween through drenching rain. They landed at Yunnan-Yi to refuel, then took off again into more rain squalls. Near the gorge, the fighter formation broke into the clear. Bright sun and blue skies revealed a river and landscape of breathtaking beauty. And hundreds of armored vehicles and trucks and thousands of Japanese troops packed onto the switchbacks from the river to the canyon's west rim and along the road on the plateau above. Nates and Oscars should have protected the massive Japanese armored column, but to Hill's surprise, no Japanese fighter planes were visible. The engineers had already completed part of the span that would carry the column across the river. At a signal from Hill, the 4 Flying Tigers slid into single file and roared into their attack. Massed together, the Japanese could put up a storm of small arms fire. The Tigers' only defense was speed. Hill and his companions pushed their throttles to the stops and dove toward the canyon. From a 60-degree dive, Hill released his demolition bomb to strike just beneath the canyon's rim, where the road began its twisting 20-mile descent.
I got up there and I saw that that pontoon bridge wasn't all the way across. Where that road winds down, that gorge is about a mile deep, and the road is cut back into the mountain. And so I was lucky enough to hit the road above with a bomb and knock the edge of the road off.
The 550-pound bomb slammed into the cliffside, precisely on target, and exploded. As Hill's P-40 peeled away, in a gut-wrenching turn, huge slabs of rock and earth tumbled onto the roadway, crushing and burying men and vehicles on the upper switchbacks. The blast from Hill's bomb destroyed the roadway at the canyon's rim, trapping the densely packed Japanese column in the gorge.
And when I hit above it, and I had a landslide, they could shovel it off. And wouldn't be any big problem. But when I knocked the edge of that road off, now they got to excavate back into that mountain, and that's rock, you know.
Behind Hill, Rector and the others, one by one, loosed their bombs and bullets onto the hapless Japanese column. Boulders, rock slides, earth, and vehicles tumbled down the slope, crushing trucks and men below or sweeping them off the roadway into thin air. The canyon gave the Japanese no cover from air attack. Like stair steps, each loop of the twisting roadway offered only a sheer wall on one side and a precipitous drop on the other. The column's only defense against the Tigers was to shoot back, but confusion and panic blunted that response. Again and again, the 4 panda bears swept into the canyon, raining fire on the Japanese. When their guns were empty, they signaled to Olson's Hell's Angels flying top cover. Olson's boys roared into the gorge, making pass after pass to strafe the enemy until their ammunition was exhausted. As the P-40s climbed away and turned toward Kunming, the Japanese were already struggling to open a way back to the plateau. Below them, the switchbacks and the cliffs were littered with crushed and burning vehicles and dead and wounded men. In single file, the Kitty Hawks attacked in a straight line to avoid careening into the canyon walls, sometimes passing a mere 100 feet from their targets. Pulling up sharply at the end of a strafing run, the P-40s tended to mush, and each pilot held his breath, hoping his plane would not pancake onto the river instead of climbing to safety. When the 4 P-40s from the 1st Squadron had exhausted their fragmentation bombs and ammunition, the 8 Kitty Hawks flying top cover dove in to take their turns at the killing ground. Like the day before, the Japanese fighter planes that should have been protecting the armored column were nowhere to be seen. All of the Flying Tigers returned safely to Kunming, though some of their planes were riddled with holes from Japanese ground fire. In the canyon, the Japanese remained trapped in the open.
For 3 days, they had no place to go. I mean, we slaughtered these guys. I don't know how many people we killed there, bombing and strafing them for 3 days.
Over the next few days, Chennault's P-40 fighters and Tupolev bombers attacked the Red Dragon Division in the gorge and west on the plateau. On the 9th of May, 2 days after Tex Hill's first attack, the Chinese 36th Division crossed the river north of the Burma Road to harass the Japanese on the plateau west of the Salween. By the 12th of May, the battle was over. The pontoon bridge that the Japanese had tried to throw across the river was a useless wreck. The roadway from the river's edge to the west rim of the canyon was all but destroyed. The canyon's western slope and the road leading west from the gorge were littered with the hulks of Japanese vehicles and the corpses of Japanese soldiers. The Chinese army dug in on the east bank of the river and stayed. The Japanese never again ventured into the Salween Gorge on the Burma Road. They placed a token force on the western rim and lobbed cannon shells across the river until they were driven off 2 years later. The American transport planes continued to fly over the hump from India to Kunming, bringing in vital supplies for the AVG and other Allied units fighting the Japanese in China, Thailand, and Burma. Chongqing did not fall. Nationalist China continued to fight on the Allied side, though Chiang Kai-Shek kept most of his forces in reserve, saving them for a war against the Chinese communists. For the Allied military and the American public, both hungry for good news of the war, the battle at the Salween River offered a rare victory and heroes worth celebrating. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, steamrolling their way across Asia and the Pacific, could be stopped. They would be stopped.
Here was news coming from a group that was defeating the Japanese in the air. We weren't getting beat by them. We were establishing victory. So it was a wonderful moral tonic.
Did the battle at the Salween River Gorge really change the war? Did it turn the tide in China and Asia? Some historians argue that it did not. The Japanese, some say, had stretched their supply lines to the limit and could not advance farther east. Some argue that the Japanese meant only to trap the Chinese army at the Salween, that they never intended to attack Kunming or Chongqing. In truth, no one still living knows for sure what the Japanese intended or what an elite Japanese armored division would have done or been ordered to do if it had bridged the Salween and reached the plateau on the eastern bank. But certain facts are clear. Japanese units in China operated with far more autonomy than the highly centralized German military.
The Japanese government didn't have the same control over its armed forces. Its onset of the Chinese invasion was entirely engineered by the Army without the approval of its superiors. And in the conduct of the war in China, the Army maintained itself with the standard light Japanese division instead of following it with the footsteps that it saw in Europe of the heavier divisions with heavy tanks and heavy artillery. And it conducted campaigns in China almost without regard to the national policy.
The Japanese had overrun Burma, capturing supplies along the way at Rangoon, Toungoo, Lashio, and other Allied bases. Kunming would be a similar prize. The Red Dragon Division did try to cross the Salween River. Its huge armored column, poised on the western approach, clearly intended to reach the plateau on the eastern side. The Japanese had taken the measure of their enemy, and they knew that the Chinese soldier was poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. No match for the Imperial Army. Kunming was just 200 miles up the Burma Road, defended by Chinese troops. It was the anchor in China's only remaining supply line, a fat war prize just waiting to be taken. If Kunming had fallen, the Allies' only lifeline to China would have been cut. The Flying Tigers would have been declawed, and Chiang Kai-Shek would probably have sued Tokyo for peace. The Americans and the British needed China to continue to fight, to tie down huge Japanese armies, and to provide the base from which to attack Japan itself. At that critical moment, Japan's iron spear was aimed at China's exposed jugular vein. That spear was blunted and turned back at the Salween River Gorge by the men and the airplanes of the American Volunteer Group.
I don't think people have ever really understood the significance of that Salween mission, and I understand that this could have been an entirely different world, you know, if that mission had failed.
Here was 1942. War had gone badly for the Allies on every front. There wasn't anywhere where things were going well. And all of a sudden we have this victory in China at the Salween Gorge. And had it been publicized the way it might have been, it would have had about an equal amount of effect on American morale as the Doolittle raid. It would have been a wonderful thing to have really exploited. But it didn't have the propaganda clout that it should have had.
Through early summer, the AVG continued to harass the Japanese. On July 4, 1942, the American Volunteer Group officially ceased to exist. It became the 23rd Fighter Group, U.S. Army Air Force. Chennault was promoted to Brigadier General commanding the 14th Air Force in China. His new superior, General Clayton Bissell, offered immediate commissions to any Tiger who would stay on in the 23rd Fighter Group. But the men disliked and distrusted Bissell, and only 5 pilots stayed on: Tex Hill, Ed Richter, and 3 other Panda Bears. It was the same Clayton Bissell with whom Chennault had so openly disagreed during the pre-war bomber mafia days. Hill returned to the States on New Year's Eve 1942. After 10 days in Washington, reporting on the situation in China, he was assigned to Eglin Army Air Force Base in Florida. On a brief trip home to Victoria, Texas, he met 19-year-old Maisie Sale.
I saw this good-looking blonde over there in church, and I told Brother Sam, I said, man, I need to meet that gal. So he made arrangements for it, and I went over to their home in Victoria.
Tex was a big deal because he'd been in life and time and a lot of magazine, a lot of newspaper stories about the Flying Tigers, and John Wayne had made a movie and played Tex's part in that movie. And Tex came in, and he walked in the front door and put out his hand to shake hands with me. And I've always said that if he had put out his hand and said, "How do you do, will you marry me?" I would have said, "How do you do? Yes, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." And that's been almost 63 years, and I feel that very same way to this day.
Maisie broke a date with a Navy cadet to spend the evening with Tex.
We had two air bases there, and all those cadets running at this sweet young thing, you know. And boy, she was having a ball with them. She had so many boyfriends, and she was a hell of a tap dancer. She could jump off the floor up on the table and tap. And so anyway, I said, well, you guys are trying to contaminate that sweet young thing. I better get her out of here.
10 days after their first meeting, Tex and Maisie were married. After just a few months in the States, Tex returned to China. Chennault had asked him to come back to command the 23rd Fighter Group. Through the end of the war, the 23rd Fighter Group was in the midst of much of the fighting in China. Always small and ill-equipped, the group took a heavy toll on Japanese aircraft, shipping, and armies. Home on leave, Tex was at the Rose Bowl game on New Year's Day, 1945. There he met General Hap Arnold, Chief of Army Air Forces, at a pre-game gathering. Arnold told Tex he was disappointed in the way the Air Force had lost so many bases to the Japanese in eastern China.
He said, I thought you guys could handle this situation over there. And I said, well, we could have if it had anything to do it with. And that started it. I said, we couldn't get replacement airplanes, and the ones we did get were a bunch of junk, war-weary stuff that came out of Barstow, Florida. He said, we've never given used airplanes for replacement airplanes. I said, well, General, I don't know where you get your information. I sure as hell know what I got. And so then I told him we couldn't get pilots. He said, we got 3,000 surplus pilots. I said, well, if you don't get them in the hands of people who can use them, you might as well not have trained them. Boy, I was hot. I'd lost some awful good guys because they kept, you know, just flying them to death. But so about that time, Mosley pulled him off of me. And he said, I want to tell you something, Tex. He said, General Arnold won't forget that. Sure enough, the next morning, boy, they had me out of bed at 5:30 in the morning, wanted me back in Washington. He had already had guys checking into it. I found out what I told him was true. And they covered us up with P-51Ds. He took care of it right away, and he just flooded that area with pilots. But, you know, the war was almost over.
In 7 months of combat, the pilots of the American Volunteer Group claimed 297 enemy aircraft destroyed, including 229 aerial kills. 19 Flying Tigers became aces. In combat against the AVG, the Japanese lost 400 pilots and crewmen, including 4 group commanders. The Flying Tigers lost just 14 pilots killed, captured, or missing, plus 6 more who died in training accidents. In its fight against the Japanese, the AVG was more successful than any other fighter group in the CBI theater.
They established an American president. They showed that the American guys were brave, that we were willing to die for our country, and it inspired people, and it continues to inspire people. The shark nose insignia still elicits the same response. People go in and analyze the combat records and minimize the number of Japanese airplanes that were shot down. None of it really makes any difference. The important thing is that they were there. They were only people who were being successful during a period in time in which we were being shellacked by Japan from one end of Asia to the other, and for that they were invaluable.
Well, It was true that we were mercenaries, but then when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, then we were involved. Our country was involved in the war. And what brought us together is that was necessity, you know. It was teamwork together, and we had a hardcore that had flown together. We didn't have people rotating through us. Chennault molded us into with 3 different branches and one of the finest fighting outfits in the world. The hardcore to this good day, really outstanding guys, and we're like family, and we cooperated in everything once the war started, and we got involved in it, and our people really turned to win this thing.
Tex Hill's favorite saying was, "If you want to have a friend, you have to be a friend." In its darkest days, China had no better friend than Tex Hill and the Flying Tigers of the American Volunteer Group.